These days, the new buzzword has been mindfulness. You pretty much find it everywhere. In lectures, in therapy sessions, workshops are held. UCLA and other places, they have their own certification programs. Left and right, you're seeing this happen. And fortunately, I mean, it's a good thing, making accessible parts, some small parts of the teachings that we find in the Dharma, being somewhat accessible to the masses. And now it's no surprise to find different traditions, different religions talking about mindfulness from their own perspectives, which is again a good thing as far as looking at it from Buddhist perspective. However, when we have a situation where every Tom, Dick, and Harry is teaching it these days, that's an old English phrase that we don't get to hear about. I mean, we read often or come in contact with these days. I think it's a lovely expression. Then we run into some problems. We're living at a time period where we love to accessorize. We love to add things to our closet, to our toolboxes. We want to have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, some of this, all of that, none of this, and a little bit of mindfulness here. That can kind of complete the picture for us. And this talk is basically focusing on what is wrong with mindfulness today. Mindfulness does not work the way it is taught today, but to the masses. So long as it is not including within its structure other elements, other items on the recipe book. See, if we need to cook something, we need to follow a certain recipe. If it's going to be a certain dish, let's say, a cake or whatever, we all know that if we miss out on one of the ingredients, it's not going to come out the way it is supposed to be. Now, in the Dharma, fortunately for us, we have so many recipes. Recipes for experiencing Nibbana. And the Buddha gave us so many different ways of making that happen. You have the 7 factors of awakening, where sati, or mindfulness, is there. You have the 5 faculties, of which the first, again, is sati. You have several others, but obviously you have in the Eightfold Path. But there's one that particularly I'm interested in talking to you about today. And that has to do with the precepts, specifically. The disciple in higher training. We usually have 3 categories of these. And then we have the 4th one, who happens to be someone who's already passed the training stage. And those are the arhats. Again, this is coming from the Theravadan perspective. Now, one of the things that we do repeat as those of us who have taken the precepts is we have 5 precepts. I undertake the training rule to abstain from, let's say the first one is not to kill or not to harm beings on purpose. Second one is the same thing. I undertake the training rule to abstain from taking what is not given. Third one is I undertake the training rule to abstain from sexual misconduct. The 4th one is I undertake the training rule to abstain from wrong speech. Now that has subgroupings: false speech, harsh speech, gossiping or slandering, backbiting. and also idle chatter. And then the fifth one is I undertake the training rule to abstain from taking intoxicants or getting the mind intoxicated. Now, if you notice, the common denominator in all of these five is the training rule. It is a training. We don't have such things as commandments. And that's another reason why in the West we have a difficulty gulping down the word morality, because it's been shoved down our throats, as one of my teachers keeps saying. So we have this disgust of the term. However, we do not need to look at it in that way when we're thinking about the training rules. And in Pali, the word itself is sikha, training. There are no, bolts of lightning that's going to come down on us. The earth is going to open up and swallow us, etc. There's no such thing when it comes to these five precepts. However, we are throwing away the most crucial part of our training towards Nibbana. And let's not kid ourselves, the Buddhist path is about attaining Nibbana, whichever way you look at it. However long the time that you spend, that's how it is. It's not just compassion. Many people say it's compassion. Yeah, compassion is part of it. The Buddha himself had Maha Karuna. Okay? But the Eightfold Path, the whole path of Dhamma, is about gaining wisdom. So on one extreme we have, of the spectrum, we have Sila, which is virtue, which is moral development. And the far end we have wisdom, seeing things as they are, being able to see different perspectives at the same time without having any kind of a bias towards whatever position. And the bridge between the two is mental development, samadhi, which oftentimes have been mistakenly translated as concentration. That's not correct. Mental cultivation means developing the mind to reach states of calmness, serenity of mind, where the mind is stable, collected, allows us to get to a point where we can see with wisdom, with eyes of wisdom. These are not themes that we read about only in books. These are things that can manifest in our own lives when we use the whole recipe ingredients. I mean, sometimes I see advertisements for like mindfulness in how to use mindfulness to improve your sexual relations, how to use mindfulness to enjoy your food better, mindfulness to make more money, Fortune 500 companies and things like that. They use mindfulness. And I was talking to a psychologist who's pretty eminent in his field. And I just was listening just to kind of picking his brain to see what his position is on mindfulness. He's like, but it's such an easy thing. Mindfulness, anyone can teach it. And I just, here you go. But that's the opinion. That is what's being put out there. There are some very well-known medical doctors, proponents of mindfulness out there. I don't want to give names, but fortunately they've been running workshops and special certification programs that you could do within a few weeks, even weekends, at the end of which they are propelling these new graduates, mindfulness experts, pushing them out into the world so they can go out and teach as well. Let's not fool ourselves. There's so much money involved in mindfulness. Teaching it, going to classes. I joke around about this because I saw one time that there was a advertisement for yoga classes with beer. It's not non-alcoholic, but actual beer. We're living in ridiculous times where we have trivialized pretty much anything we not only touch but even gaze upon. So I feel very strongly about this because many of these individuals or so-called teachers do not realize the harm they are causing not to other beings, just to other beings, but to themselves. Because misrepresenting the Dhamma brings about tremendous karmic negative influences on oneself. That's why you need to be very careful when using the words of the Buddha. Because even the highest of the Arahants, they had to check and double check and triple check themselves every time they said a word. These were full-on awakened beings. And then they had to go back to the Buddha himself to check in with him, to see whether they misrepresented him by any chance. And you do have instances where the Buddha kind of exhorts them or I wouldn't say scold them, however, just for the intention of helping the future generations of Buddhists and students to completely understand. They cannot do this and that and this, misrepresenting, because remember, and that is the main theme that connects everything that I'm trying to talk about today, which is sila, or virtue, moral development. See, when we remove hiri and ottappa, what they mean, those are the Pali terms, they are moral shame and moral dread. Shame and moral dread. They are part of our training. See, there are no shortcuts. If we just do mindfulness, we like that, we'll keep it. We like energy, which is part of the five. So basically the five powers, they're also called in this sense the five powers of a trainee, or sekas. Faith, shame, moral dread, energy, and wisdom. Wisdom has to be there. Unfortunately, when we look at mindfulness solely on its own, that's not going to cut it. You're not going to get your favorite grandmother's favorite apple pie if you just have apples. Or instead of sugar, you put salt. Or instead of flour, you put sand. You get the point. So we need to be very critical when we are studying and especially practicing the Dhamma. And many people think that by taking the precepts early in the morning or whenever they come to mind, that's it, that's good. That's not it. The most important part of practicing the precepts is to become aware when we're right there at that fork in the road kind of situation, where it's so easy for us to break the precept. And sometimes we will break it. That's fine. That's why it's called a training rule, right? But become aware of it and immediately retake the precepts right there and then. That introduces awareness. That introduces shame and moral dread, which is what I'm going to talk about now, next. Shame has an inward movement to it. It has an inward momentum to it. It involves self-respect. Even if you were in the middle of nowhere, nobody's watching, there's no cameras, nobody's Instagram is open, or there's no live feed anywhere, and it's just you. Your thoughts, your feelings, the act that is about to be committed, and something compels you to say, no, I won't do it. Why? Because it goes counter to who and what I hold myself to be or work towards. So that is the shame element. The second one is moral dread. That is more outward directed. Would those whom I hold so dear, perhaps teachers, perhaps parents, perhaps very close friends whom you trust, would they look down upon this act once they find out? Or even better, what if that teacher was right there next to you? Would they be okay with it? This act, this thought, what if they penetrated your mind? Because the training has to do with all three doors. Your thoughts, your speech, and your body. See, when the Buddha talked about kusala and akusala, wholesome and unwholesome choices we make, he always referred to the three doors. Acts that we can commit through this body, for example, stealing, killing, etc., or sexual misconduct. I would even say acts that we can commit through the speech, lying, harsh words, idle chatter, gossiping, slandering, hurting somebody else with words, and then through thought. Even the thought itself. Imagine if the Buddha or the teacher or that person whom you hold so dear is presently aware of your thoughts, clearly, as clear as you are of them. How would their position be? That is the moral dread. Next comes the energy part. So first, we started with faith, which I'll go back to in a second, but faith, shame, moral dread, energy, because you cannot hold yourself here to sit in this heat without some level of energy. Forcing yourself to sit through this heat. Yesterday we did a 2-hour retreat here, meditation. Some of us were here. And we even had a fan that's directly was on us, and it didn't do much. But we sat through it. Watching all the hindrances that came up and went, why am I here? All these thoughts. See, we have to have an internal gauge in our lives, which is missing in today's spoiled society that we live in. We've accessorized everything. We want a little bit of this and a little bit of that, a lot of this and none of this, yes. And we have to be careful not to squeeze in mindfulness in there, as we like it, under those terms. See, character is often necessary. This practice builds character. When a person attains sotapanna or stream entry stage, their eye of Dhamma is open. There is personality change. If there is any alchemy out there, that is it. The transformation takes place. However, with every single moment that we apply the 5, faith, moral shame, moral dread, energy to maintain your steady course, inevitably it opens the door for wisdom. Wisdom, oftentimes it's such a uncool word these days. My mom used to say it's like looking for something in broad daylight with a flashlight that works, using it, and you still can't find it these days. It doesn't have to be that way. So we need to hold ourselves accountable. So this path is also about accountability. That's why it's not for the weak of hearts or of minds. So we need to practice with diligence, which brings about faith. The trust in the practice comes in. No one has to convince you. Your experience of it, of its truths, are sufficient. And I'm just inviting you to look at things in a little bit more cautious or careful way, and not to just gulp down whatever is out there. or is being promoted as Dharma or even as mindfulness specifically. Because mindfulness without moral development is doomed to failure. And we're just fooling ourselves. You might have several different titles. You might wear different things. It means nothing. Different names means nothing. And remember that even at the time of the Buddha, there were monks and nuns and lay people that were there and listening to actual Buddha speak. Had many, many precepts. Monks, for example, had 227. And they still did not, some of them, they still did not attain awakening, not even the first stage. Imagine what an opportunity that was wasted. So, what that means, at least for me, is that it is such a personal path. And I hate to say it, it's a lonely path. But it's a wondrous path. Because your experiences anyhow are a very personal part of your life. You cannot express your full experience to someone else, even if you love them to death. That apple pie, the way you experience it, you will not be able to convey that experience to someone else in that way. So, are there any questions or something that might have triggered while I was talking about this? Because I want to give you some, we still have time, I can go on, but I wanted to see, just interject and see. Yes? Yes. This is what my dad used to do. And he also had a big hand. When I said, well, Dad, this and this or so has this or has that ability or can do this, and he would just hold his hand. I was like, so? He said, not a single thumb or finger on a single hand is similar to the one next to it. So we need to be careful in just looking at it with generalized perspective. I was like, okay, if one person or a multitude of individuals were attaining the eye of Dhamma, which is the Sotapanna stage at least, then everyone should. No. The path you took to get to this temple today is different than hers, than mine. So every one of us has our own path. And that's one of the reasons why the Buddha said, looked at people who were sobbing over their loved one's death. He said, your only inheritance is your karma, nothing else. Your karma is what you have to deal with, carry with, be burdened with, until you attain full awakening and you die. But not prior to that. Even the Buddha had to deal with his own karmic fruits of past lives, being a Buddha, until he passed away. So your karmic fruits are what you deal with. So similarly, the practice that you put in, the energy that you put in, the wisdom that you gain will not allow you to go ahead and break the precepts to begin with. As you're practicing mindfulness, which is a crucial part of getting to Nibbana. See, some people come in and say, they've asked me many times, I researched it many years ago when I first started across the street, years ago, a quarter of a century ago. We used to be students at the feet of the same teachers, so privileged to have you, from those days. But the question that used to come up was a lot of this. Basically, I had this in common. Is enlightenment sudden or gradual? Well, it depends on how you look at it. You walked in through this door. If I isolate that event and say, this gentleman just walked through so suddenly. However, that's not entirely true, is it? You took step after step after step, mile after mile, as you pushed down the gas pedal, and finally presented here. So we have to look at it in the grand scheme of things when we're looking at those events taking place. And they are true, by the way. Whatever you read in the suttas, they're experientially there for us to see it in our own lives. So there's no doubt in my mind, anyhow. So, yes, Russell. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. It is a good question. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. No, it's a valid question. It's something that I've had to deal with when I first started my journey in the Dharma, and I've heard from other students as well. And basically the question itself is asking whether there is a difference between actions you've committed intentionally in their fruits, in their results, and actions that you might have committed unintentionally. And how do you see that in the arena of things happening to some people where a child can die even at birth? An elderly person lives all the way past being a centenarian, over 100. So what's the difference? Or a person gets a huge inheritance, or is born to a royal family, but is a leper, or has some very serious disease. Where does that leave all that wealth and prestige? So all these things the Buddha tried to explain. I say tried because, and there's many suttas in Samyutta Nikaya, some Majjhima Nikaya, and in Digha Nikaya a lot. These are the major Nikayas, the major books of the suttas in the Theravada tradition, by the way. But he did also put a caveat there that only a Buddha can actually see the conditions that might ripe into something else, and the details of certain action or certain thought that you might have had in XYZ lifetime that resulted in this that's taking place now, or in a few lifetimes later has a propensity of turning into XYZ. And just a few of his highest disciples could do that. But as far as we're concerned, there are so many clear diagrams, maps of what type of karma produces what. For example, there are so many stories. Patachara, she was a woman, beautiful woman in the suttas, that finds herself a husband. However, she falls in love. They fall in love. However, her in-laws don't accept her. But in Indian culture of that time, she had to go and live with them. So she leaves behind her own family, who also disowns her because she doesn't get their approval, which is very odd in that culture. So for the longest time, she's unable to conceive. And one day she is able to conceive. However, being unwanted by her own in-laws, she thinks, well, I need help. Let me go and beg to my parents, and they'll take me back, and they'll help me with the labor. Halfway through, the husband finds out, runs after her, and coaxes her to come back, and they have a child. A year or two later, the same thing happens, and the in-laws still don't accept her. She runs back, and this time the husband is too late, and then finds her later in the forest about to give birth. And the husband's like, now we're caught between your parents and your in-laws, my parents. And there's a storm coming. And she says, go and get me some food, some wood, so we can burn, so we can actually stay warm, because the baby's going to come tonight. And he does. He tries to go and get some food while the little boy is left with the mom. As he's looking through the dead leaves and twigs and wood, a cobra comes out and bites him, and he dies on the spot. She's worried. She's about to give birth. There's two basically, one of them is a child, is an infant, but the other one's on the way. She's worried about her husband, so she starts walking around like, what happened? And then she sees him dead. I'm describing the pain. And then she realizes that the only way that she can get out of that is to go ahead and cross the river. So she carries her child, while pregnant, through the river. She gets onto the other side. Actually, no, one of the children is over here for some reason, and she's crossing the river. And as she does so, she gives birth. And now, while she's in that state, she walks back to get her other child. An eagle comes down and grabs the baby. She sees this, she's freaking out. I mean, beyond freaking out. I don't have words for that. And she's losing it. At that point, she's walking, I think, she's carrying her other child. And the river comes and throws him off through her arms, and she loses him, and he drowns. What would you do? She goes mad. She starts tearing off her clothes, and she's yelling and screaming in the village as she gets there. Fortunately, it's the village, Savatthi, where the Buddha was staying at. So for some reason, she's able to run through the hills, through the streets, to get to Savatthi, where her parents were, to go to get some comfort. At that moment, there was a fire at their house, and both of them burn alive. This is there, this is in the sutta. I'm not making this stuff up. And what do you do? She's going now, stark mad, and the monks see her approaching the gates. She's yelling and screaming, and the Buddha sees her and sees that she's ready to receive the Dhamma, and says, let her pass, let her pass. She approaches. This is also an answer to your question about being at the right place, right time, only if you've done enough work. She comes over, and the Buddha says, be mindful, child. Mindful, right? And the Patachara just at that instant calms down, and a lay elderly man gives his cloak, his robe, to her to cover her. And the Buddha sees what has happened, comforts her, and explains to her the causes that have brought about even the very newborn baby not to have lived for 30 seconds or a minute on this planet, yet he was plucked out of the sky by an eagle and killed. As Buddha is explaining these things, she attains Sotapanna. And she immediately requests the Buddha for ordination. And the Buddha goes through the slew of explanations about even the parents who are now ash. I mean, this woman was, come on. From every angle she was being hit with karmic fruits. However, in her case, that were the required conditions, apparently, for her to get to that point. Otherwise, she might have lived happily, this and that, with kids, with in-laws, parents, everybody's happy. But no Dharma. So in her case, her resolution had been many, many lifetimes earlier, as the Buddha explains in that sutta, that she had bowed down at his feet and said, I want to be the number one bhikkhuni, a nun, who is the most excellent at the Vinaya, the precepts. Many eons earlier. And finally, the fruits come about in this lifetime, because her request was, her aspiration, her wish was, I want to be the bhikkhuni who is the most excelled in the Vinaya, or the precepts, the code of discipline for monastics, at the foot of a living Buddha. And there she was. So sometimes all of these things have to come to fruition in different ways. Similar to this, my explanation to that question, attempt at it anyhow, is only merely one. There's so many different ways of addressing that question, which I would love to go over in future talks as well. So I have a feeling there might be more questions, but can we take one more? Yeah. Homero. Thank you. Sorry. I hope that addressed. Yeah. We'll talk more about, yes. 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 Yeah.
But I'm getting the sense from your talk today that it's not that easy going, that there's more pressure on it. At least that's what I felt from this talk. You need to work this path, or you need to put in the energy. You will not be coming back. You need to. It felt to me almost like
yes.
So I'm just curious, am I misunderstanding, or is there some aspect that I need to more?
Discipline. Discipline. That's what we're lacking. It took discipline from you to put on that outfit, to do your hair, to make sure you're shaved, to take a shower, to do all that needs to be done before you walk out of your house. Correct? That's what I'm talking about. We want to get it easy, just like that psychologist, acquaintance of mine, who said, mindfulness teaching, it's the easiest thing in the world, apparently. No, it's not. Living a path, any path. Now, yes, granted, in Catholicism or Christianity, I in my teenage years, I was living in a Christian monastery to become a monk for many years. And I know exactly what you mean. There were punishments. However, there's none of that in the Dharma, in the Buddhism. However, that does not negate the importance of approaching it with decency. And see, you're not going to get something for nothing, and that's the attitude, unfortunately, in this society that we have. Discipline is required. If you're going to cultivate a body that's going to be healthy, fit, you need to discipline it. No one can argue that. The same way with food. If you eat junk food, you're not going to get the healthy, fit body. Discipline. If you want to experience mindfulness and really attain its fruits, you need discipline. There's no ifs and buts about that. So what in a nutshell, is being taught outside. Is mindfulness devoid of the shame factor? Of energy? Might be there, maybe not, but wisdom is completely out the door. Faith is, what is that? And moral dread doesn't even exist. We have to be very careful of that. It's like those fruits that are plastic that you found on grandma's fruit bowl in the kitchen. You try to grab it out. What is this? It's nonsense. Nonsense. So that is not the mindfulness we are taught in the Dharma. So I hope this also helps other people who are unsure about what it means. Thank you for listening. And I'll be here for more questions.